Okay, let's move on to the second Richard Wolff video, and this one's on inflation. So here he talks about inflation and just tries to again address some of the common,
And much harder to understand.
yeah, common myths behind it. So let's play this clip.
So let's talk about what causes an inflation. One of the biggest mistakes cultivated in our culture by very important special interests is the notion that there's some unique relationship between the amount of money in circulation and prices. Let me be clear with you, there isn't. When you increase the quantity of money, if that money is used by the people who get the new money, the extra money, typically in our society, banks and institutions like that, it will only raise prices when they spend that money. And when they spend that money, it may or may not raise prices. This is very important. There's no necessity that prices go up. Let me give you the simplest example I know of. Let's imagine that the money supply is increased. The Federal Reserve increases the money supply. And let's assume, just to make the story simple, it goes into the hands of the bank. Or if you don't like that, let me imagine with you that helicopters fly over the American cities and drop the money, and we all run out with baskets and collect the bills floating down. Okay, now there's a lot more money in the economy. And you know who knows this? Business. They know that the public has more money to spend because they know what the Federal Reserve is doing, whether it's increasing the money supply or not. And at this point, the employer makes a decision. The manufacturer, the company that sells any service, they know people have more money to spend. So here's what they decide. Either the way you deal with that is to raise your price. Why? Because people have more money to spend, and so you can reasonably expect to get the higher price. Or, here comes the key issue, folks, or you can decide that the way you want to respond to the extra money in the economy is by ordering more goods to sell for that extra money. The second one gives people jobs making the extra goods, and we tend to like that. But the first one, jacking up the price, that's not getting anybody a new job. That's just getting the seller more because there's more money in the economy. Why am I stressing this? The answer is simple. Employees, the vast majority of us, we don't set prices. But employers, a tiny minority of us, they do. They're the ones who decide what price gets put on that tag connected to the software program, the haircut, the hamburger, or anything else we buy. It's a decision of employers that is the cause of every inflation.
Now that I watched this clip, Sam, I really like this clip for the first part because I don't want to argue too much about how much inflation is going on right now and stuff. But one of the big reasons that in mainstream or maybe more libertarians also started talking about inflation around 6-7 months ago was because like, oh, the US is handing out, they're sending these checks and the government is pumping money. Oh, this is going to lead to inflation. And that's like the first thing that he addresses, that just putting money more in circulation doesn't necessarily lead to inflation whatsoever. It depends then when the money is spent, and of course then on a bunch of other factors which he doesn't get into, which could affect inflation. So I just kind of wanted to use it as that. And I feel like a lot of the fear of inflation came from initially kind of this idea that, okay, oh wow, now that as if the US hadn't bailed out others before or hadn't pumped in money into the government, into the country before. But then he goes on, when he goes after that, and he kind of says it's always the employers that are responsible for inflation. And I understand that in like a strict sense, because, okay, the employer, he's the one who decides when to raise the prices. I found that part to be a bit like simplistic and
the
not
seller, not the employer.
The employer.
Does he?
Yeah, he uses the word employer specifically, and then he says we're all employees, so we don't set the price. So I mean, technically it is true But I mean, you should maybe discuss some of the forces that are sometimes more legitimate that push prices up, or for employers to increase prices. Because yeah, technically speaking, it's the owner of the business that makes that decision. But that second part, I was a bit less convinced, but I really like this first argument concerning inflation.
I mean, this specific video, to be honest, was not my favorite of Mr. Wolff's on inflation, because in fact, I think he's one of the best people on the matter, because he's not, you have this camp that is since 1970s is just basically inflation phobic and uses it to justify neoliberal policies, and talks about burning money because it's cheaper than buying wood and all that shit. And it's, yeah, fuck off. Especially in the US, by the way. Again, US economy is different from rest of economy. US economy provides global money supply. So it has a much more buffer to, for inflation in a way. Anyways, but so he's one of the few people who doesn't belong to, obviously, that inflation phobic neoliberal camp, but also doesn't belong to this left-wing camp that says, oh no, let's give money to everybody, let's give handouts, invest in that, invest in this. And looking at 70s, I can give you a number of examples. No, and okay, then you get to Mr. Wolff's position, which is the perfectly balanced position that, of course, it's about how it's done, right? But I put the onus on a state, because employer as a single entity is always in the position of competition and fears the competitors.
Typically,
so
right?
In that situation, he would have psychological incentive towards inflationary tactics, right? So the onus on it is on a state. And again, Iran is a good example in 1970s, for example, that the money, the oil money was, I think that was the main reason for the revolution, by the way. Like all the stuff you hear about American coup d'etat and religious stuff, all of that, I am sad to say, is largely bullshit. The main reason was the overheating economy following huge pumping of oil money into the economy, and then suddenly falling oil prices, and then you had inflation, blah blah blah. So yeah, of course, it's about how you do it. And I agree with Mr. Wolff that there should be I assume I agree with Mr. Wolff that employers should not act in that way, and there should be a state and local regulations regarding that. But it reminds me of the immigration issue. Whenever I debate I would say some respectable right-wing people, they say, yes, we agree with you, but what you're saying will never happen. We agree with you that, immigration is good if government has programs that integrates people and do that. We agree with you, government is good if they funnel the money in the right way and organize the system in the right way. But the reality is, what you're saying, having good people in government who are not corrupt, who don't do these things, is a fantasy. And so, of course, whenever you have quantitative easing, whenever you have money going into the system, it will go to the big banks, it will go to the oligarchs, it will lead to corruption. So we don't oppose it in theoretical sense, we oppose it in matter of fact sense. My argument would be, well, isn't the whole point of politics to fight against that corruption? But then they would say, yeah, but you live in a fantasy land. So
yeah, but I mean, you can say that about anything, right? Like any issue plagues that. I mean, just right now I thought about the Afghanistan withdrawal. Like, wouldn't it be better if the withdrawal was done better? But this is the kind of withdrawal that is done,
sure.
And this is how people in power acted.
Sure, but I mean, I would say that just saying that, of course, quantitative easing, governmental investment, whatever you want to call it, printing money or just redirecting money, it's easy to say it will boost the economy and it's good, but the devil is in the details, and there is so many
100%.
goddamn details, and people should be open to significant expansion in bureaucracy, which they are not. People fear bureaucracy, while we actually need to significantly expand it just to keep track of all these
Mm.
things.
No, no, no.
I think.
No, that's a good point. And your initial point about Wolff, Richard Wolff, being kind of, he's very careful with the whole inflation thing, because even I think it was a month or two ago watching again his Democracy at Work, and he said anybody who
He's
tells
not an
you that,
inflation denier.
yeah, exactly. It was like anybody who tells you that inflation is going up or going down, they're talking crap, because there is no way of knowing right now based on everything. I mean, that's kind of what I'm saying. Mark Blight, I believe he's a bit more, yeah. He has a more fixed position, or he takes more of like a position on inflation, I believe. So hopefully I look forward talking to him sometime soon in the new year, maybe.
Sure, I would say he's more of a scientist economist, while Mr. Wolff is more of a theoretical economist. I would say this is a general view based on a couple of books I read and shit. So please don't, I don't.
No,
Yeah,
I like that.
I'm not completely familiar with their epistemology, but I would, from what I've, like Mark Blythe talks about details far more than Mr. Wolff, I think.
No, you're totally right about that. Makes sense to me as well, based on what I've heard him say. That sounds like a fair description.